Parable of the Walls. A man was walking along life's road, on his way to self-discovery and understanding. Sure, life on the road gets difficult. Things happen to cause anger, confusion, betrayal. But he wasn't concerned about it, because he knew that everything was an opportunity for growth, and that nothing really would stop him. He would meet people along the way from time to time. He stopped and talked, chit-chat, clever words, modest bragging. Some passed him, running as if from a fire. Others he passed as they dawdled along the way. Some, walking the other direction, gave him curious looks as they passed. One day he was walking down the road, and he squinted and saw something in the distance. At first it seemed just like a line across the horizon, but as he moved closer, he could see that it was a stone wall. A long, high stone wall, taller than himself. He looked along the horizon, but he couldn't see a way around it. And so he approached the wall, and he stopped, and he thought. He felt he had to continue in the direction he was going. It was, after all, the road to finding himself. And that was, after all, the point to life. As he studied the situation for a time, he noticed vines growing up the walls. He pulled on them. They were strong enough to hold him. So he tugged and heaved himself and got to the top of the wall. He was indeed right. The road continued on before him, and so with confidence, he jumped down from the wall, glad to feel his legs beneath him. Then he resumed his walk. Now he continued on the road, occasionally stopping to talk to others about that strange wall. It seemed purposely to be put there for some reason. It took some effort to climb up it, but in the end, it was no problem at all, and he felt stronger for it. It didn't kill him, after all. And now he walked and walked. Sometimes he was tired by his endless perambulation. Nevertheless, he knew that the exercise was doing him good. He passed villages and trees and farms, bees humming in the fields, flowers blooming. A lovely girl waved to him from a distance. He stopped for a moment to spend time with her, and then he continued. What a pleasant walk it was. Yet he couldn't stop. He had a destination. But as he walked and walked, he began to feel irritations in his shoes. But the road ahead enticed him, and so he continued. Until he looked ahead and saw a line across the horizon. It was similar to the first, but darker, more pronounced. And when he arrived, he saw that it was indeed another stone wall, much taller than the first. Again, there seemed no way around it, and so he looked and found another vine growing against the wall. This time, however, the vine seemed older, more fragile, but it would still hold him, and the stone wall was slightly flatter. But he huffed and puffed and boosted himself to the top. It was a long way up. The view from behind was obscured by a row of trees, but the road seemed to continue before him, if more overgrown. And falling from this height would probably hurt, but he felt he could probably just jump down if he were careful. And so with a lurch, he tumbled down, hitting the ground, rolling, yet spraining his ankle in the process. He stood up in some pain, dusted himself off, and found that he could walk on his bruised leg, though with some throbbing. And yet as he looked down the road, he could sense a wistful call forward onto it becoming, to an arrival. And so he marched on. The land was now wilder. The trees seemed past the turning point of summer, still lush, yet brittle. At one point, he passed a woman under a tree off to the side of the road. She was scuffed and had with her a young boy in dirty clothes. A hand was held outstretched. He searched his pockets and found a few coins. She thanked him with a strange look in her eyes. And as he walked, he felt guilty because his coins could do so little for her. And yet, he had to find him so. And the rocky road beckoned through a gnarling forest of blighted trees. He walked on and on. His ankles' pain remained a constant friend. He could feel blisters developing. The woods seemed thicker now, more impenetrable. And then, up ahead, around a bend in the road, seemingly out of nowhere, another wall emerged. This wall was dark, missing stones, yet it was massive in comparison to the last wall. His heart sank, but then he felt he had to try to get around it. He thought for a moment about turning back and retracing his journey, but the idea of climbing those walls again didn't appeal to him. Besides, what was there at the beginning of his journey? And then he thought of the eyes of the pleading woman. He couldn't face them again, and even worse, the strange, sickly eyes of her son. And so he looked at the wall and said, "Let's do this." Now, there was no single vine to help him climb up the wall. Rather, it was a combination of branches from trees, holes in the wall from missing stones, and just plain willpower that brought him sometime later with scratched fingers to the top of the titanic wall. This time he could see that the wall curved around a mountain which lay before him, and further up he could see a castle or fortification, and he smiled to himself. Now the effort would pay off. Now he could do it. Behind him lay a darkening, opaque landscape, but ahead of him the light rested brightly on the hill, and so all he had to do was descend the wall and move forth along the small trail before him. But that was easier said than done. There was no obvious way down. He walked along the ridge of the wall, looking for something. At last he came to an iron rod protruding from the wall. Attached to it was an old rope. This was the way down. Others had been here before him. Only the best, he thought to himself, make it this far on the road. He held on to the old rope and started to move hand over hand, slowly downwards. The distance below frightened him, and the strength of his hands was not what he thought it was. His muscles spasmed. He lost his grip slightly and began sliding down the dry rope. His hands singed and burned in writhing torture as he slid. And it was too fast. He gave one last attempt to halt the slide, but it didn't stop him, and suddenly there was no more rope. He fell through the air, hitting his elbows and knees on the wall, and then the ground met him with a complete thudding disdain. He lay there stunned and exhausted. His head was scraped and pulsing, his joints bruised, even bleeding. He slowly tried to stand. His body would scarcely obey him. But then again, his will was nearly absent as well. But in the darkening gloom, he could make out the trail, and so he limped over to it. The leaves on the trees were falling here, and he pulled an old branch from the side of the weedy trail and used it to steady his loping gait. He conjured up within himself a state of satisfaction at having accomplished so difficult a feat. He continued to hike up the hill on the lonely pathway. The terrain grew steeper and rougher. At times he wasn't even sure it was a path anymore. And then in the dark wood he noticed a pair of eyes, canine eyes, following him. He ignored it in his slow ascent, but it did not ignore him. He turned and looked in the looming dusk and could make out a large black dog padding steadily on his trail. He felt his stick to use it as a club if he had to. The dog came imperturbably after him. Beads of sweat streamed down his scarred face. He braced himself for a fight, but none ever came. Suddenly before him were the walls of the curved citadel rising out of the mound into the darkening sky, illuminated by the full moon as much as by the last shards of light shooting through the land. And then his heart broke. He looked and saw how high the wall was. He thought of his battered body. His fingers were hideously scabbed and stinging now. This wall was 10 times higher than the last. The dog came up to him and stared at him steadily, as if trying to tell him something. He looked down the hill and could see 2 other shapes moving towards him. He looked around at the wall and saw a great tree that ascended into the air next to the wall. "This is the way," he said aloud. The great black dog placed a step towards him. He began to climb up the tree with some difficulty, and yet it seemed as if there was indeed a well-worn pattern, and so he heaved himself up, straining and grunting as he went. Soon the ground below seemed distant, insignificant. The dog lay there waiting. The other shapes came into view, but he could not identify them. At one point, he was stopped by something in his way. The skeleton of another man nestled in one of the boughs of the tree. It was dry, wearing raggedy clothes and a pained smile on his face. It smelled of rancid meat. He tried to get by it, but knocked it over, instead causing the skull to snap off and fall down to the bottom, sending a strange noise up from below. But he couldn't think about that. He had to keep ascending. Then he came to a choice. The branches of the tall tree were intermeshed with the old crumbling stairway on the upper outer zone of the fortress. He could leave the tree, or he could continue up it. He paused and chose the stairway on the outer edge of the wall. He tentatively leapt from a vine-encrusted branch to the stone steps. He began to move slowly, all the while hugging the wall and staying away from the perilous side of the ledge. He moved up and around as well. The tree and the darkness kept him nearly in a state of blindness, though he had glimpses of the moon from time to time. But he climbed and he climbed until at last he came to what felt like the end of the stairs. And below him yawned the distance. Yet it wasn't the end of his journey. There were remnants of the stairway and empty holes for feet and hands, and so he continued trying to climb up the side of the wall. All the while, pain racked his body, and bitter resolve impelled him on, as he felt for the next toehold, as he felt that sudden death would overwhelm him in the gulf below. Yet he wanted his reward. After all, he deserved it. He would finally find himself here on this mountain, on the top of this citadel. At length, with extreme effort, he pulled his body up to the highest rung on the wall. He lay there on the top, ready for an epiphany. He raised himself up and looked ahead of him, and saw only a black concentric abyss falling straight below. It was merely a circular wall, like a large brick smokestack. He turned and looked backwards, and in the light of the full moon, he could see that he had been moving steadily into the center of a vast encirclement of walls stretching on forever. And now he understood the looks of the people he had passed at the beginning, who were going the opposite direction. Far below him, the black dog whimpered, turned, and walked away. So what in the world was that parable about? Well, obviously I'm not going to sit and explain it to you. It's, you know what's happened. For one thing, I invented that parable years ago. I invented it just as something I would tell, sometimes as an illustration about how, I think in fact one of my time series, I mentioned this, but it's how I always have heard people, and this is a very post-60s things, people talking about that they had this relationship with this person, and then it fell apart, and then they'll say something like, yeah, but I'm growing from the experience. To which I just wanted to slap them and say, like, no, you're losing from the experience, because every time you go through a relationship, it makes it that much harder to have faith in someone next time, and that much harder to commit yourself in time. And in fact, the more you go towards this ideal of finding yourself, following your dream, just becoming the person you're supposed to be, not that you shouldn't be a person that you're supposed to be. I think Jordan Peterson's emphasis is correct, because he hooks it up with responsibility, which would be like commitment. But the idea of the most important thing, I hear these people saying, the person at the end you really have to trust is yourself. The person you really have to believe is yourself. John Lennon, the song God, I don't believe in, he says, I don't believe in Beatles, don't believe in Bob Dylan, don't believe in anything. I just believe in me. And then he says, Yoko and me, to which I'm laughing, going like, yeah, do you know how problematic that relationship was? Do you know how problematic John Lennon's relationship was with himself? Do you know he was not a good person? Oh, yeah. So, well, imagine this. Imagine you spend your whole life trying to fulfill your dreams. And you know what? I've watched older folks, as they get near the end, so much is burned away. And if you want something real in life, you have to commit yourself to doing real things for other people. You cannot live alone. As John Donne, the great poet, said, no man is an island.